For 100 years, one company ruled America's rails like royalty, carrying presidents and millionaires across states. The Pullman Palace Car Company owned luxury travel. But when the world changed, when machines began crossing the skies and highways stretched to every horizon, Pullman made one fatal mistake. This is the story of how arrogance killed America's greatest railroad dynasty. The pioneer sleeping car was not just transportation. It was a revolution on wheels. Upper berths folded gracefully to the ceiling. Lower seats transformed into beds with the pull of a lever. And for the first time in American history, common travelers could sleep like kings while crossing a continent. This was not the first sleeping car ever built, but it was the first one that actually worked with elegance and comfort. Before Pullman, companies like Woodruff's Central Transportation Company had attempted crude sleeping arrangements. Their designs were uncomfortable, impractical, and frankly miserable for overnight passengers. Pullman studied these failures and engineered something entirely different. His pioneer car, first debuted in 1865, represented a quantum leap forward in passenger comfort and mechanical ingenuity. Within 2 decades, Pullman's cars would roll across 125,000 miles of track. That represented 3/4 of every rail line in America. Think about that for a second. This was not just market dominance. This was complete and total control of luxury rail travel across an entire continent. But here's what made Pullman truly brilliant. What separated him from every other railcar manufacturer of his era. He did not sell his cars to railroads. He leased them. The railroads paid him for the privilege of offering luxury, while Pullman supplied everything: the cars themselves, the maintenance, the staff, the immaculate white-gloved service that made his company the world's largest hotel. By the 1920s, 9,800 Pullman cars carried 26 million passengers every single year. The logistics alone were staggering, and Pullman controlled every single aspect of it. Pullman did not just build sleeping cars. His company expanded into parlor cars, dining cars, and even street cars. The innovation kept coming, wave after wave. In the 1880s, Pullman introduced vestibule trains, which linked cars together via covered gangways. This sounds simple now, but it was revolutionary then. Passengers could walk between cars in any weather, protected from rain, snow, and wind. Before vestibules, moving between cars meant stepping onto an open platform, exposed to the elements and the very real danger of falling between moving train cars. Some railroads initially resisted the vestibule design. The Chicago and Rock Island Railroad held out, refusing to adopt the new standard. George Pullman simply waited them out, and eventually forced buyouts or partnerships until his vestibule system became the industry standard. This was how Pullman operated: innovation combined with aggressive business tactics and an absolute unwillingness to compromise. His patented paper wheels reduced the noise of rail travel, making overnight sleep actually possible. His cars featured carpeting, libraries, and card tables. These were not just trains. They were mobile drawing rooms for America's elite. Presidents rode Pullman cars, starting with Abraham Lincoln. When Lincoln's funeral train carried his body across the nation in 1865, it included a Pullman car. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. Pullman had become synonymous with prestige, dignity, and American progress itself. But who was George Pullman, really? What kind of man builds an empire this vast and then controls it with such an iron fist that it eventually leads to the empire's destruction? The answer reveals everything about why this company ultimately failed. George Mortimer Pullman was born in 1831 in New York State. He apprenticed young in cabinetry, learning precision and craftsmanship from the ground up. But his first major fortune did not come from furniture or trains. It came from an engineering feat that seemed impossible at the time. Chicago in the 1850s was built on swampland. Buildings sat directly on mud, and the city desperately needed sewage systems to prevent disease and improve sanitation. Pullman figured out how to jack up entire buildings, brick by brick, while people were still living and working inside them. He would install sewage systems underneath, then lower the buildings back down. This required mathematical precision, engineering genius, and nerves of absolute steel. One miscalculation, and an entire building could collapse, killing everyone inside. Pullman never miscalculated. This success gave him the capital and confidence to pursue his railroad vision. His epiphany came from personal experience. Cramped overnight trips on early trains were torture. By 1859, he converted Chicago and Alton coaches into upscale sleepers that rivaled steamboat cabins. The wealthy paid premium prices for comfort, and Pullman realized he had found his fortune. The wealth flowed in, and in 1880, Pullman did something extraordinary and deeply revealing about his character. He built an entire town, not just a factory, but a complete planned community on 4,000 acres near Chicago. Queen Anne-style homes, manicured arcade park, the Grand Hotel Florence, named after his daughter, and massive factories employing thousands of skilled workers. The architect Solon Spencer Beeman designed the buildings. The landscape designer Nathan Barrett laid out the parks and greenery. It was beautiful. The homes had gas lighting and indoor plumbing, luxuries that were rare in urban slums of the 1880s. The streets were clean and orderly. Everything was maintained to perfection. Visitors called it an ideal city, a glimpse of America's industrial future, where workers and capital existed in perfect harmony. But underneath that beautiful surface was something darker, something that revealed the fatal flaw in George Pullman's character. He did not build Pullman Town for his workers. He built it for himself, for his vision of perfect control. Rents were deducted directly from wages. Pullman targeted a 6% return on investment from the town, though he only achieved 4 to 4.5%. There were no elections in Pullman Town. The town agent, appointed by George Pullman himself, oversaw every aspect of life: sewage, streets, shops, rules, and regulations. Everything flowed from Pullman's office. Saloons were limited to the Hotel Florence, where Pullman could monitor who drank and how much. Workers could not own their homes. They could not vote on local matters. They could not open independent businesses. The town was designed for order and efficiency, not freedom and autonomy. Critics at the time called it benevolent feudalism. The economist Richard Ely praised the amenities, but condemned the surveillance and excessive charges. He wrote that Pullman had created a system where workers were economically trapped, living in a beautiful prison where their landlord, employer, and governor were all the same man. And George Pullman's response to these criticisms? Nothing. Silence. He knew his system was perfect. He had engineered it to perfection, just like his train cars, just like those Chicago buildings he had raised over swamps. In Pullman's mind, he was not a tyrant. He was a benefactor. His workers should have been grateful for clean streets and modern plumbing. This arrogance, this absolute certainty that he knew better than everyone else, would eventually poison his entire company. Pullman hired mostly white-skilled labor for his factories, but for the porters who worked on the trains themselves, Pullman hired black workers, many of them formerly enslaved people looking for employment after the Civil War. The reasoning was economic and racial. Black porters could be paid extremely low wages, far below what white workers would accept. These wages were supplemented by tips from passengers, effectively making travelers subsidize Pullman's labor costs. The porters worked brutal hours, maintaining perfect service with forced smiles while earning poverty wages. This system lasted for decades until 1925, when A. Philip Randolph organized the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. This union would eventually become one of the most important civil rights organizations in American history, but its creation revealed another aspect of Pullman's arrogance. He believed black workers should be grateful for employment, no matter how exploitative the terms. When they organized to demand better treatment, the Pullman Company fought them viciously. By 1893, George Pullman's empire looked invincible. He controlled 3/4 of American rail sleeping car service. His company was worth millions. His town was internationally famous. And then the bottom fell out. The Panic of 1893 crashed through the American economy. Banks failed. Businesses collapsed. Unemployment soared. For railroads, the crisis was catastrophic. They had overbuilt tracks across the country, and now passenger numbers plummeted. Orders for new Pullman cars dried up almost overnight. George Pullman looked at his balance sheets and made what seemed like a rational business decision. He slashed 2,000 jobs from his workforce. For those who remained employed, he cut wages by 25%. But here's what George Pullman did not cut: the rents in Pullman Town. Workers found themselves in an impossible situation. Their wages had been cut by 1/4, but their living expenses remained exactly the same. Families began to starve. They could not afford to leave Pullman Town because they had no savings. They could not afford to stay because the rent was eating what little wages remained. In early 1894, workers elected a delegation to meet with George Pullman. They wanted to negotiate. They wanted their employer to understand that people were suffering. George Pullman refused to meet with them. When the workers elected delegates to represent them in negotiations, Pullman fired those delegates. On May 11, 1894, the workers walked out. The Pullman strike had begun, and what started as a local labor dispute would explode into one of the bloodiest confrontations between capital and labor in American history. Eugene V. Debs and the American Railway Union backed the Pullman workers. The ARU was a powerful national union, and Debs called for a boycott. ARU members across the country refused to handle trains carrying Pullman cars. Within days, rail traffic across the Midwest ground to a halt. Chicago, the hub of the American rail network, was paralyzed. The federal government intervened. President Grover Cleveland sent federal troops to break the strike, claiming that mail delivery was being disrupted. Violence erupted. Trains were sabotaged. Troops fired on crowds. By the time the strike finally ended, 30 people were dead. And George Pullman? He sat in his office and refused to compromise of any kind. His company posted closure signs on locked factory gates. But dividends to shareholders continued flowing without interruption. The wealthy investors who owned Pullman stock kept receiving their payments while workers starved and died in the streets. The courts upheld federal injunctions against the strike. The government established the first major precedent for federal strike breaking. The American Railway Union was crushed. Eugene Debs went to prison. George Pullman won. The entire nation had watched a wealthy industrialist let people die, rather than admit he might be wrong about rents. The Pullman town, once praised as an ideal city, was now seen as a symbol of corporate tyranny. The Illinois Supreme Court eventually ordered Pullman to sell the town in 1907, a decade after George Pullman's death. The grand experiment in paternalistic control was declared fundamentally un-American. The strike revealed something crucial about the Pullman Company that would haunt it for decades. This was not just a labor dispute. It was a symptom of monopoly power run amok. Pullman's dominance in sleeping car service meant he faced no competitive pressure to treat workers fairly or keep prices reasonable. The Sherman Antitrust Act had been passed in 1890, specifically to break up monopolies like Pullman's. But enforcement was slow. For decades after the strike, Pullman continued to dominate the sleeping car market, controlling routes, prices, and labor conditions with minimal oversight. This monopoly power bred institutional complacency. The very dominance that made Pullman wealthy also made the company slow, arrogant, and resistant to change. Some innovations did happen. Pullman tested air conditioning systems between 1927 and 1929. But the rollout was slow, limited, and conservative. Passengers had been demanding cooled cars for years, suffering through summer heat in those beautiful but stifling wooden cars. Pullman took its time because it could afford to take its time. In 1934, Pullman introduced the M10000, a lightweight car that represented a genuine technological leap forward. But by then, the company was already decades behind where it should have been. The monopoly had made them lazy. Success had made them blind. World War II seemed to prove that Pullman was eternal. Wartime travel surged. Troops moved across the country by rail. Civilians traveled to visit servicemen before deployment. Pullman was busier than it had been in years, maybe ever. By 1941, Pullman had 600 lightweight cars in service. These cars ran on glamorous streamliners like the Union Pacific's City of Portland. The company even ranked 56th among military contractors, building warships alongside rail cars. Pullman porters served America's elite and military officers. Everything seemed to indicate that the company would thrive forever. And then came 1945. The war ended. Soldiers came home. And America began changing faster than anyone had anticipated. Automobiles, which had been a luxury before the war, became common. The federal government began planning an interstate highway system that would eventually span the entire nation. Families that had relied on trains for long-distance travel started buying cars and driving themselves. Local train service began hemorrhaging passengers. And then there was aviation. Airlines had existed before the war, but they were small, expensive, and limited. During the war, aircraft technology advanced by decades. Long-range bombers became long-range passenger planes. Military pilots became civilian pilots. Airports that had served fighters and bombers were converted to civilian use. By 1950, something remarkable happened. Pullman carried 16 million passengers that year. The airlines also carried 16 million passengers that year. They were dead even. Half a century of Pullman dominance, and suddenly a brand new industry was matching them, passenger for passenger. That should have been the alarm bell. By 1953, just 3 years later, the airlines had doubled their passengers to 26 million. Pullman's numbers had fallen to 13 million. In 3 years, airlines had grown 100%, while Pullman had lost 20% of their business. The mathematics were simple and brutal. A Pullman sleeper from New York to Los Angeles took 3 nights and 4 days. But a DC-6 airplane made the same journey in 11 hours. And jet airliners were coming, planes that would cut that time in half again. The Boeing 707 was in development. The future was supersonic. Highways were devouring local train service even faster than airlines were taking long-distance passengers. Families could drive themselves across multiple states. The flexibility was intoxicating. The world was changing at a speed that would have seemed impossible just a decade earlier. And Pullman's leadership responded with the same arrogance that George Pullman had shown 60 years earlier during the strike. They assumed luxury and tradition would triumph over convenience and speed. Pullman did innovate during this period. They were not completely asleep. They did see some of the changes happening around them. The company introduced air conditioning in the late 1920s. They built lightweight cars to improve fuel efficiency and speed. In 1948, they introduced the Skytop lounge cars, observation cars with curved glass domes that offered passengers stunning panoramic views. These Skytop lounges were gorgeous. They represented the pinnacle of railroad luxury. But here's the problem. These innovations were reactive, not proactive. They were incremental improvements to an existing model, not revolutionary changes. Pullman was making better train cars in a world that was moving beyond train travel entirely. Consumers were demanding more private rooms instead of open berths with curtains. They wanted modern amenities. They wanted lower prices. Pullman made some of these changes, but slowly, cautiously, conservatively. The company was still operating with a monopolist's mentality, making the minimum changes necessary to maintain market share rather than aggressive changes to expand and evolve. Here's the twist in Pullman's story. The very monopoly that had made the company wealthy and powerful had also poisoned it from within. For decades, Pullman had faced almost no real competition. This lack of competition meant easy profits from leasing contracts. High fares produced high returns without anyone challenging them. This monopoly power bred institutional arrogance. Not just in George Pullman, though he certainly embodied it, but in the entire corporate culture. Generation after generation of Pullman executives grew up believing that their company's way was the only way, the best way, the eternal way. They had succeeded for so long that they could not imagine failure. In 1944, the Supreme Court finally took action. After years of antitrust complaints, the court forced Pullman to divest its operating business from its manufacturing business. The monopoly was being broken up. The Pullman Company, which operated the sleeping car service, was sold to 57 different railroads in a deal worth $40 million. Pullman Standard kept the manufacturing side of the business, building new cars for railroads that now owned their own sleeping car operations. The Chicago plant, the historic heart of the company, where thousands of craftsmen had built those beautiful cars, closed in 1955. The end was near, and somehow Pullman's leadership still could not read it. And still, even with all of this evidence, even with passengers fleeing to airlines and automobiles, even with their monopoly broken and their market share collapsing, Pullman did not transform. They did not pivot. They did not adapt in any fundamental way. Other companies facing technological disruption evolved or died trying. Some railroad companies added bus services to compete with automobiles. Manufacturers diversified into new industries, leveraging their expertise in new markets. Pullman Standard built some trolley cars. They manufactured 2007 trolleys between 1931 and 1952. They built subway cars, including the R46 cars for New York City. These projects delayed the final collapse, bringing in revenue and keeping some factories running. But they were sidelines, tangential to the core business that was dying. The company kept building sleeping cars for a market that was vanishing. They had spent a century perfecting the railroad sleeping car experience. They had more expertise in luxury rail travel than any organization on Earth, and that expertise had become a prison. On December 31st, 1968, the last Pullman sleeping car made its final run. On January 1st, 1969, the Pullman Company ceased to exist. Assets were auctioned off. The name was stripped from cars still in service, erasing the brand that had defined luxury travel for a century. Pullman Standard, the manufacturing arm, lingered on for a while longer. When Amtrak took over American passenger rail service in 1971, they needed new equipment. Pullman Standard built the Superliner cars for Amtrak between 1978 and 1981. These double-decker cars are still in service today, carrying passengers across America on long-distance routes. But this was the last gasp. In 1987, Bombardier, a Canadian company, absorbed what remained of Pullman Standard. The town of Pullman, that grand experiment in industrial paternalism, became a national monument in 2015. From 1867 to 1968, 101 years of market dominance ended in absolute extinction. So what modern companies do you think are making the exact same mistake right now? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, hit that subscribe button, because there are dozens more stories like this one waiting to be told.